Augustine, I think very rightly, rejects this faint or staged interpretation of Chrysostom and Jerome. Augustine basically says that that mode of interpretation could be used by heretics, by perverse men, to question all sorts of statements by the apostles in their writings. Ironically, Jerome's interpretation is also at least partially motivated by resisting enemies of the church, like Porphyry. But from my perspective, worrying about what heretics or enemies will do or won't do has very limited value. Heretics and opponents are going to twist Scripture in whatever way they want to, regardless. Augustine has a much stronger point when he says that such an interpretation of the Galatians 2 incident between Peter and Paul, namely that it was fake or staged, this casts doubt and uncertainty upon all Scripture and its authority, and that the truth is highly prized by Paul and Scripture generally. Augustine makes the same point in letter 40 to Jerome, asking what authority will be left to the Scriptures if we believe the confrontation between Peter and Paul was a deception and not real. And how can we use Scripture to break down error when its authority has thus been undermined? How can we accept such an interpretation without allowing the wicked or the heretic to do likewise with a passage he dislikes? Lastly, Augustine points out that Paul himself introduces his narrative in Galatians 1:20 by saying, "The things which I write unto you, behold, before God, I lie not." What a great point by Augustine that Paul starts off by emphasizing the truth of everything he is saying. Augustine makes this same point in letter 82 to Jerome. Augustine makes another great point, pointing out that if we are going to believe that the Apostle Paul's account was not really true, and that Peter didn't actually do anything wrong or condemnable or even imprudent, then what is to stop someone from refusing to believe that Peter denied Christ or that David committed adultery and murder? Again, Augustine says it is far better to affirm the truth of Scripture without questioning its trustworthiness and to learn from even the praiseworthy and excellent men that it rebukes than to admit suspicion of Scripture out of a desire to protect the reputation of such men. Notice he says that it is the actions of such praiseworthy and excellent men that deserve rebuke, not their teachings or preaching or authority. In responding to the charge of hypocrisy against Paul, again, Augustine says he would prefer to believe that both Peter and Paul had sinned or were hypocrites than to believe that Paul put down any false statement in his letter to the Galatians. Augustine's primary concern is to preserve the purity, authority, and trustworthiness of Scripture, rather than that of any apostle, whether Peter or Paul. Augustine discusses this in more detail in his treatise called On Lying. And this does seem reasonable to me. But again, Augustine believes that Peter acted wrongly, not that Peter taught or preached wrongly. So Augustine is not questioning or denying Peter's unique leadership role and authority. However, I am still skeptical of how Paul and thus how Augustine characterized the wrongness of Peter's action. Peter's separating himself from the Gentile Christians may be more of an inaction or sin of omission, and thus could not be characterized as compelling anyone to do anything, strictly speaking. Again, unless Peter specifically said something to that effect, I don't see why we should assume that he compelled the Gentiles to do anything, whether directly or indirectly. While I understand Augustine takes Paul's words at literal face value, I believe it's possible, and perhaps even reasonable, to believe that Paul mischaracterized or spoke too strongly about Peter's separation or withdrawing as an act of compulsion. And I believe one can believe this without casting any doubt on the inspiration of the letter to the Galatians as Scripture. But even if Peter truly did do or say something to wrongly compel the Gentiles, even such an abuse or error can be absorbed by Catholic theology without disproving Peter's and the papacy's unique leadership role and authority when formally exercised. And that precisely is the key. Peter was not formerly exercising any teaching or magisterial authority by separating himself from Gentile Christians.